Good afternoon, everyone. This is Amy Gopp, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. Disasters, as we all know, are the expected unexpected. By their very nature, they catch us off guard and usually unequipped. Expecting and preparing are two vastly different notions. While we know intellectually to expect disasters, we rarely do. None of us wake up in the morning anticipating a tornado will rip through our town that day. Yet disasters occur and they shock us. And usually we end up feeling extremely powerless. This is why preparing for disasters is so essential. To be proactive is to prevent us from feelings of powerlessness later. We cannot necessarily prevent disasters, as we all know, but we can prepare for them. And this is, of course, why Brandon and I, during our many years of serving together on the staff of Week of Compassion, the relief fund of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, along with Chalice Press, felt it was so important to create the resource guide, Help and Hope, Disaster Preparedness and Response Tools for Congregations. This webinar is based on this book and seeks to convey key learnings from it. As people of faith, of course, we want to help. That's just who we are. Our faith drives us to serve those in need. But we are often so eager to lend a helping hand that we do so without understanding how best to help. The question is never whether we should offer help in a time of need, but rather how can we most effectively help. As we together discern how best to help, I want to take a moment to thank all the members of Church World Service, and especially those who are actively engaged in the Development and Humanitarian Assistance Roundtable. We could not do this work alone. Responding to a disaster and healing from its aftermath takes more than any one church or community organization could ever do on its own. This is why our most effective relief is always offered ecumenically. So a sincere thanks for all the denominational partners and member communions of CWS and to all of you on this webinar in our joint efforts to offer help and hope to literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people each and every year. I also want to thank my CWS colleagues for their many contributions to the book. Their expertise make this book an incredibly rich resource based on actual lived experience. So thanks so much. Brandon, over to you.
So much, Amy. We're again so glad that you've been able to join us. We timed this webinar to coincide with National Preparedness Month, which is September 2014, and this year's theme for Disaster Preparedness Month is Be Disaster Aware, Take Action to Prepare. And Help and Hope is actually designed to be the practical toolkit for congregations and individuals to be able to do exactly that. What we have hoped for Help and Hope is that it can be a resource that will help you prepare for before, during, and in the event of recovery following a disaster. It will help you kind of figure out what it's like by painting a picture for you so you can imagine what the community might look like post-disaster. Provide some technical advice. How do you get in touch with people? What do you need to have prepared just in case something happens? As you deal with your faith community or your wider community, what might be some of the physical, material, psychosocial, and pastoral needs that the community faces? And what can you learn about long-term recovery that will help you prepare for the weeks, months, and years after a disaster, as well as tools that might be available for your congregation to learn how to heal. So what we've hoped to put together is a really practical resource that has study and discussion questions for you to work on in order to design a plan for your faith community and wider community, as well as relatively short, quite accessible chapters that can be digested quickly and used practically. These are ideas, advice, and best practices that come from people who have been in the midst of disasters, people who have professionally responded to disasters, and people who have learned a lot along the way so that you can help digest some of those best practices for your congregation and your community.
And so, there is a section in the book entitled The Congregational Toolkit that includes very practical, concrete recommendations. And by the end of this webinar, we hope you'll know more about what to put in your disaster toolkit, if you will. As colleagues Brian Crowshore and our Barry Shade call it in chapter 19 of the book, Systems and Supplies, every member of your congregation, indeed everyone, would do well to create a survival flash drive that includes all of your important documents on it. Create a memorable password, make copies of the drive and place it in the most disaster-proof locations, including with a family member who is not in your community. On page 119 of the book, there is a checklist of all this needed information and documents that you would want to include on your flash drive. In addition to what your members place on their own survival flash drives, create one for your congregation. Keep it ready to go in a safe place where you and other staff or other members could get to it easily. Include contact information. This is so important for all your members and their families, and congregational financial records. Having an off-site backup for such important information is essential. Next, you may want to assess your church building and urge members to assess their own homes. For a congregation, you'll want to be sure that the trustees and board, along with other key lay leaders and the pastoral staff, are involved in an assessment of your buildings and grounds. Is your building up to code? Are sprinklers or fire alarms installed? Does your congregation have a person identified or persons to serve as safety coordinators should a disaster happen? You may even want to recruit a congregational emergency response team. Who would be on that team? Is your congregation prepared to shelter in place in case disaster strikes, meaning shelter your own members and others from your community within your church building? Do you have a continuity of operations plan that covers relocation from destroyed or damaged facilities to a pre-identified alternate location for worship, staff working space, or fellowship? In a time of crisis, as we all know, pastoral leaders are called upon to offer professional care and counseling to those most affected by the disaster. Is your church board ready to support this priority and make alternative arrangements for the normal day-to-day activities to continue? Is your church ready to arrange for a caregiver for the caregivers during and after disaster, as well as pay for that service if necessary? And last, please have your hazards and vulnerabilities checklist handy on your survival flash drive. Where can you find this? In the book, of course. This and much, much more info on what to put in your disaster toolkit. And once you have your survival flash drive and all the systems and supplies in place, it is time to focus on what is perhaps the most critical aspect of disaster preparedness: knowing your community. Since no single group can do by themselves everything that needs to be done to help a community recover, building relationships with others in your community is the best starting point. Assessing your local community for collaborators, expertise, and resources helps you begin to understand how your community is most susceptible and how to build resiliency and a specific disaster plan. If connections have not been made in your community before the disaster, it is a struggle to get organized in the midst of chaos. Brandon and I have seen this time and again. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster, many individuals and congregations want to help and will rush to take action. But again, our question remains, how best to help? Without pre-planning, without preparing, our efforts can not only be ineffective, but sometimes even detrimental. Resources that have been identified in advance will set up a more efficient process and will also enable good stewardship. So how to assess your community? First, sit down with other congregational leaders and define your community geographically. Is it your neighborhood, your city, town, county, something else? What makes up your particular context? Then, depending on how you define your community, catalog the resources available to you there. As you build relationships, work together to utilize those resources, create a plan, and develop a network that is poised to respond to the community's needs. Forge relationships across an ecumenical spectrum, across religious traditions, and with your local emergency management agency and other government bodies such as FEMA. Establish relationships with social services, disaster response organizations such as VOAD, the American Red Cross, and of course, Church World Service. Then map the assets in your community. What are the gifts, skills, and capabilities of individuals within your context? Are there neighborhood organizations, clubs, or social groups that would be helpful to include? What are the formal structures and institutions within the community? Schools, key businesses, healthcare resources? It's also important to assess the physical and social vulnerabilities, and Brandon will speak more to this in a bit. In essence, one of the most critical ways to prepare for a disaster is to know your community. Establish relationships, build a network, and map the assets of your context so that you are able to best respond and immediately respond when disaster strikes.
Thanks, Amy. That's exactly right. In terms of knowing your community, one of our strategies in developing this book was to not only have sort of procedural advice, this sort of checklist or bullet point sections that would help you identify tasks, but to also include some advice and experience and best practices from people who have been there. And so we have a number of chapters that focus on what it was like to be in the midst of a disaster. Jill Michael is a pastor who served in Joplin, Missouri during the incredible tornado that struck there just a few years ago. And she tells a really great story about a community transformed even in some surprising ways for the better. She tells a story of not only the tornado, but a smaller, more local disaster that rocked through the community following the tornado a few years later, and how the community responded, and how its resilience and other qualities developed following the tornado. They faced an act of vandalism that they could not have responded to. Michael often hypothesizes in this essay, had they not been able to build the relationships and the resiliency following the tornado that struck. We also hear from Tyler Whitke, who also served as a pastor in Joplin during the tornado. And we've joked that he's become kind of our resident storm chaser, as he served not only the church in Joplin during the tornado, but also worked with AmeriCorps in West Liberty, Kentucky, in months following a tornado that struck there. And what Tyler offers is a really unique perspective on communication, talking from the perspective of a pastor in the midst of the disaster that struck Joplin, and also as a volunteer who had to coordinate communication efforts in the recovery in West Liberty. He talks about everything from setting up a great, solid communication network in the days and weeks that follow a disaster, as well as the challenges of technology. What happens in your community when cell towers are blown down, for example. He offers those sort of perspectives in doing that sort of work. Jay Hartley is a pastor in Nashville, Tennessee, who does an excellent job framing the pastoral response in the context of disaster-affected communities, and focuses a good bit on listening and community building, as well as how to leverage relationships that already exist in one's communities into resources for recovery. Another example we want to bring out is Ruoma Camp, who has experience working with FEMA in Houston, and following Hurricane Katrina, founded Grace Community Services, which is a disaster case management and education organization. And she focuses on working with folks who are economically and in other ways particularly vulnerable in their community. She cites a really important stat that 10 to 15% of community members won't be able to recover on their own following a disaster, and that there are folks who, whether it's because of own economic circumstances or structural racism or other sorts of challenges, are going to be particularly vulnerable and have particular needs. And she gives some good advice and strategies for helping folks who are ostracized by society to get the help that they need. Oftentimes, systems for folks who are disregarded by society, the structures that we put in place that we think are helpful are often unfamiliar and intimidating. And she also gives excellent advice for those of us who are tasked to help. Remember that when you assess the needs of folks who come to you, an assumption, be that a stereotype, some other sort of cultural assumption, class assumption that you may have, is not the same thing as an assessment. So she gives us really good advice and helps us to think through what it means to respond to the whole community, not just the community that you may be most familiar with. So in these articles and in several others, what we hope to do is give you sort of a 360-degree look at what are the aspects of a community in recovery. We like to kind of think of this in terms of the view that you might get using Google Maps. For example, when you pick a site on Google Maps that you want to see and you zoom into that street view and you're able to kind of look around and see the whole environment, that's the sort of view that we hope folks can get by gleaning from the information in this book. So that's what we hope to do, so that you'll know what it's like, why you need to prepare, and what you can do both in preparation for and in recovery from a disaster.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Let's look a little more now at how congregations particularly can best respond when disaster happens in another community or even overseas. After the horrific earthquake in Haiti a few years ago, I started using a phrase that would eventually become our mantra at Week of Compassion: pray, pay, stay. Sometimes we stitch it up and say stay, pray, and pay, but regardless the order, I hope you get the idea. After disaster, one of the worst things you can do is rush to the disaster zone. As our dear colleague Josh Baird, Director of Disciples Volunteering and also a contributor to the book, put it, rather than becoming a distraction or a nuisance, showing up uninvited and becoming part of the disaster within the disaster, be sure to ask yourself this critical question: whose needs am I really trying to meet? We encourage pastors and lay leaders alike to ask that question of your congregations. There will be a time to go and help, but in the immediate aftermath, what is truly most helpful is to stay put, pray for the victims, and send your cash donations and offerings. Monetary donations are always more helpful than any other kind of material donation. Believe me, we all have stories of the unusable, unhelpful, and usually unwanted items that pile up in disaster areas. Some people use disaster as an excuse, as Josh Baird writes, to clean out their garages or the back of their closets. We hope you will educate your congregation or community organization not to do so. But as people of faith, however, our natural instinct really is to want to rush and help. So as we sit tight to stay, pray, and pay in the initial aftermath, in the months to follow, you can begin to organize volunteers to actually go and help rebuild. But in the meantime, if people desperately want something hands-on to do, we highly encourage you to assemble Church World Service cleanup buckets. The longer the recovery takes, the more important mission teams will become, but much, much later on in the recovery process. But you can tap into the desire and energy of your congregants to organize a trip in consultation with your denominational disaster ministry or Church World Service to go at a later time. Volunteers are important, but timing of that volunteerism is even more important following a disaster. In addition to helping your community know when to volunteer, you can also help your congregation respond to disaster through worship. Create the space to pray for those impacted by the disaster and for those first responders already on the ground. Create rituals in your worship setting that allow people to release their feelings of sadness, bewilderment, helplessness, anger, and even trauma. There are sections in the book with Bible studies, sample prayers, and even sample music. We've included sections on preaching to help pastors know how to express the good news during a time of utter bad news. Offering the proper psychosocial and spiritual resources to people in your community and as part of the overall recovery efforts is also essential. And of course, everything that the church does should be considered spiritual care, but an intentional, intensive offering of pastoral spiritual care will be necessary post-disaster. A congregation that is best prepared to reach out emotionally and spiritually is also one that has in its disaster plan and toolkit a resource for referrals. Spiritual care is best offered alongside a strong network of agencies that your congregation has already identified to which you can refer folks, including mental health resources and professional counselors. Last, just as we stayed and prayed and will continue to pray, so do we pay as a response to disaster. As mentioned before, monetary donations, cash, is the best way to respond. To direct those offerings and gifts and tithes to the organizations that you trust, such as Church World Service and your denominational relief agencies. Together, we do more than we could ever do alone. And when we already have the funding in hand to be able to respond immediately when disaster strikes, we are able to do our best work. In fact, as Johnny Ray states in his chapter, to make a financial commitment to giving before a disaster strikes is part of the spiritual discipline of stewardship. Stay, pray, and pay. May that become your mantra too.
Thanks, Amy. I think another thing that's key to sort of remember in that stay, pray, and pay mantra is that keeping that as a discipline really feeds into the ability of agencies like CWS and many of the member denominationally based organizations that work with CWS to help support and participate in long-term recovery. Long-term recovery, as some of you may be familiar with, is a methodology. It's a commitment. It is a community-based approach to responding to disasters and helping the communities that are affected to not only respond but to rebuild. And there's a great section in Help and Hope that Josh Baird and Sandra Kennedy O's authored that walks readers through the principles of long-term recovery. So many things that I find really helpful about the long-term recovery model include the fact that it is a model that really involves the community. It's an investment. It is a model that does, as Amy said a little bit earlier, leverage the assets that already exist in a community in order to help a community help itself, to heal and to get a glimpse of the hope that comes from recovery following disaster. As you can see from this diagram that is taken from this chapter on long-term recovery, putting together a long-term recovery group is a comprehensive effort that ideally meets a comprehensive set of needs. Everything from case management, so that folks who are economically vulnerable or don't have the capacity to rebuild are able to have their homes returned to them. Resource development, which helps feed the construction and donations that bring folks back to a new normal, as well as coordination of volunteers who come from all over the country in order to support rebuilding efforts. Communications that keeps it on the radar of communities outside of the affected community. Spiritual and emotional care, that is always part of any sort of recovery effort following a disaster. And advocacy, again, helping to keep those issues on the forefront in the wider community, particularly when it comes to folks for whom recovery is not as easy because of economic or other types of vulnerabilities. So this is a great model that is comprehensive. It empowers communities, and it really asks that all hands be on deck, that everyone participate, and it gives a mechanism for bringing folks from all sorts of walks of life, all sorts of skill sets into leadership and participation. So there is, as we mentioned, a great chapter on this, but the chapter also references and pushes people towards some even more comprehensive resources, such as the Long-Term Recovery Basics webinar that is part of this Church World Service series, and the Community Arise curriculum CWS has produced that gives some great instructions and some of the methodology around putting together a long-term recovery group, as well as the long-term recovery guide that is produced by National VOAD. VOAD, as some of you may not be familiar, stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And it is a coalition of committed organizations, both faith-based and community-based, that support this sort of work. So I would highly encourage you all to check out those resources, as well as the great essay that Sandra and Josh contributed to this book. As you engage in the long-term recovery process, there may be a number of resources that you will want to pull upon. And in Help and Hope, we focus on a number of those. As Amy mentioned, it's incredibly important to take notice of not only the spiritual care, but the psychosocial care resources and needs, resources that are available and needs that you all are facing in your community. And to that end, we have a variety of essays on the best practices in terms of evidence-based research as well as pastoral care. And we want to highlight one of those resources, and that's Children's Disaster Services, which offers not only services to children who often have particular vulnerabilities following disasters, but it also is an exceptional opportunity for folks who want to volunteer, who want to go through training and receive background checks so that they can be there to help communities recover in a very unique way. There's an essay that highlights the Children's Disaster Models by Judy Bizon, who is the former director. And if you look at the website, which is available through the wider brethren.org website, you can get in touch with Kathy Fry Miller, who serves currently as the director. If you're interested in learning more, interested in learning how to volunteer, and learn more about that model. One of the things that folks may not be aware of following a disaster is the need for focusing on management of media. Matt Hackworth, who serves as Director of Marketing and Communication at Church World Service, offers an exceptional essay providing advice on how to deal with the media. And he focuses on the fact that oftentimes a big part of disaster management is media management. It's important to figure out who it is in your community or who it is on a long-term recovery group who is appropriate to speak to the media, who represents your group, who represents your community, who represents the other organizations and established means of producing this sort of recovery efforts. It's important to kind of think through what the story is, and it's important to think through how to handle calls, how to message the recovery, and how to respond when people ask questions that may catch you off guard or point you toward some uncomfortable rumors that may be flying around your community following a disaster. One of the things that we also focus on, a quick resource that you can grab and have around quickly, is a quick checklist of do's and don'ts. Again, what we have tried to put together with this book is a really practical tool. And this in particular is something that we've designed in order to provide really quick, good advice, especially during the gap between the immediacy of a disaster and the long-term recovery process. And these are suggestions that draw upon the experience and knowledge of not only faith-based disaster response organizations, but also colleagues from FEMA and all sorts of volunteers who make up community-based long-term recovery groups. So these are great suggestions that help you very quickly kind of think through what are some best practices. For example, checking on your members, neighbors, and those who are elderly, disabled, or vulnerable in other ways is a great idea. But on the other hand, self-deploying as a volunteer, which Amy covered a little bit earlier, grabbing your truck and your chainsaw and heading into a disaster zone when you're not trained as a first responder is probably not the best thing to do. So if you look on page 130 of Help and Hope, you can find that. And again, there are a number of resources, not only through the member communions of CWS, but also plenty of denominations have all sorts of resources that are available, from mission funds like Week of Compassion to more comprehensive programmatic resources like the United Methodist Committee on Relief, or UMCOR. So we have a little something for everyone, I hope, listed in our denominational and other kind of parachurch resources, which you find on page 123 in the book. So those are some of the things that we hope will augment your journey through preparedness and recovery.
And last, when disaster strikes, and this may seem so obvious, but it's really important to lift it up, and that is to say that remember that God is with you. God is right there in the rubble. Hear now the words from Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. God is our help and our hope. And the question is not, will a disaster strike our community? It is rather, when disaster strikes our community and affects our lives, how might we be best prepared to respond? Our hope and our prayer and our charge to you today is to prepare to expect the unexpected, for it is indeed very holy work.
We're hopeful that this has been helpful for you as we have considered all of the angles, all of the degrees of the 360-degree look at disaster and recovery. And there are more of this information is available if you want to order a copy of Help and Hope. You can do that via the Chalice Press website. You can also connect with them toll-free by phone, or you can search for a link at cwsglobal.org. Search for the Help and Hope book, and it will show you a way to order. And proceeds from this book support CWS and We Who Compassion in enabling us to do more of this sort of work that helps impact communities at their most vulnerable. So we're really appreciative of the time that you have spent with us today and would love to open up for any questions.
I hope you ask many questions. We may have Carol and Sandra, my colleagues, read out the questions, and hopefully Amy and Brendan or any one of us will answer them for you. Carol and Sandra, please.
Hey, Carol here from CWS staff. Sorry about the echo. You've got the information, or you just had the information on screen about the book. So I think that answers the questions of several. What's the full name of the book and how do we order it? The recorded webinar, this webinar recorded, and the PowerPoint with notes will be at our website, cwsglobal.org/LTR webinars, long-term recovery webinars, LTR webinars. And then links to resources and book information will all be consolidated right there on LTR webinars on the site. I hope that answers that question. Now there's some more meaty questions. Here's one. Oh gosh. Let me start with, there was mention of an on-site workshop that is presented for helping communities recover from disaster. What does that cost and how much notice is needed?
I may answer that. My colleagues and I, we usually work with the local, the state voluntary organization active in disaster in the initial onset or response to a disaster. And if a long-term recovery group is forming, and then they can invite us in, and we can do our one-day workshop in collaboration with our member communions, and there is no cost to any of the local communities. So our training is free. Any consultation we can give you is free. We don't charge you a cost to provide our services.
Okay, here's another question. Can you speak to some best practices for churches who get inundated with donations? I have worked with one such church in the past week during a wildfire in that community, and this spring at a church that was the focal point for a major landslide that killed more than 40 people. Best practices for churches that then get inundated with donations.
Sure, I would love to speak to that. First of all, I'll say that one of the phrases that we often use to describe those sort of donations is SNOW, which stands for stuff no one wants, because this this is an opportunity that people often take to, as Amy said, clean out their closets and get rid of all sorts of junk. What I would first of all kind of recommend is get out the word to your church members. First of all, to not accept and certainly not to bring those sort of donations to a church. So number one, do that. Number two, provide an alternative, and you can provide an alternative in a couple of ways. One, you may very well be connected to a denominational mission fund or a disaster ministry that you can encourage people to give to. If folks want to do something hands-on or give something, encourage them to look at things like the CWS cleanup buckets and put together kits and those sort of things, which are available. Instructions for putting those together are available at cwsglobal.org. Another opportunity, is you can take an opportunity to be creative. I've known of churches that have received those sort of unwanted gifts and have done what they call virtual mission trips. And so they've taken those items and they've sold them in garage or rummage sales. And they've enlisted members of the youth group to go and do things in the community like mowing lawns for folks who can't necessarily do that themselves anymore, and asking for donations. And so the proceeds from that sort of volunteering and the rummage sale then go to their church mission fund to help support needs in their community's disaster or a faraway disaster as well. So I would say, number one, discourage that, do that sort of education around what best practices are. Number two, create opportunities and alternatives. And number three, if you still find yourself inundated by that sort of junk, that snow, find the local Salvation Army thrift store or Goodwill and take the clothing there.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Next question. Does Church World Service accept individual volunteers if I am dealing with somebody who wants to help with a current disaster, but they don't have enough time to go through our denomination's disaster training? And if CWS does not, do you know who does?
I guess I answered this. I'm not aware that CWS accepts volunteers to actually go and help in a community affected by disaster. But there are many organizations, especially depending, for instance, on your faith affiliation, as we pointed out, AMCOR, often Methodists are involved, Mennonites, the Lutherans, World Renew, United Church of Christ, the Disciples. They have volunteers that go out and help with the rebuild after a disaster. So if you get in contact with any of these sites, and then of course a great partner from us, and I can't forget them, is the American Red Cross. So there are many organizations that rely on their volunteers very heavily and would welcome to have you, I'm sure.
Great. Next question. And I'm not quite sure to whom it's addressed, so you'll know who it is when you hear it, I think. Are you using the established community emergency response team concept used in many states to train your congregation emergency response teams? If so, how effective has this been?
I'll speak to that. This is Amy.
I would say that yes, go ahead.
Go ahead, Brandon.
I was going to say that, I was going to say that is when Amy referred to the congregational model, that is built upon that community emergency response team model. And I would add that As is the case with long-term recovery groups, it varies from community to community, depending on not only the resource and capacity, but the commitment of each member in those groups.
Right.
Okay. Related question, also related to an earlier question. As well as being inundated with tangible donations, what would you recommend concerning being inundated with spontaneous, untrained volunteers?
This is Barry. I'd like to try to answer that. And it goes with what we were talking about in the earlier question concerning volunteers and how to volunteer. On most significantly sized disasters, there will be a volunteer center set up, probably in conjunction with the Red Cross and other organizations. They will have a hotline or a phone number to call in for you to be able to volunteer your services and identify your skill sets. And if it's something that can be used at that time, they will tell you. If not, they'll tell you to wait until a time that's appropriate. For those volunteers that come early, with that, you have to identify their skill sets, and you'll have to organize very early to do that. But if they're not needed, the hard thing to do, but necessary thing, is to simply tell them, we need your help, but not now. Please come back later.
Right, and if I could chime in here as well, this is Amy. I think I would just add, I think you probably, hopefully, throughout this webinar, and certainly throughout the book, when you read the book, it's very clear that we're trying to promote proactive education. And I think this is just one area, and helping people beforehand understand how best to volunteer and how best to help. And I think this is why that kind of education is so key, because in the moment, people are reactionary, and they're also really desiring to help. And so this is why we if you've heard throughout the presentation, kind of this common thread that's woven throughout, it really is that what we do ahead of time to proactively educate and inform our congregations is really, that's the best. That's the real work of disaster preparedness, is the work you do ahead of time, so people understand that in the moment, it's not that we're not grateful for the help, but there is a time when it will be most helpful.
Okay, not much time left and several meaty questions left. If we don't get to you, we'll answer you by email. Early on, you mentioned congregations should be prepared to provide shelter in place for their own members and the public. Give just an idea what that means. Closets full of cots, food, showers. What can my congregation do now to prepare in advance to serve as a shelter?
That's a great question, and that is part of what we deal with in the congregational toolkit section in the book. And you'll want to assess your own building and think through what it would mean. What is your community? What does it look like? How big is it? Those are the kinds of questions that only you can answer in terms of your particular congregation and the size of your local geographic community. But I think those kinds of things are exactly what is most helpful to think through. Showers, having cots. Is there evacuation routes that are well marked? Do staff, are they prepared? Are Sunday school teachers prepared should something happen to take care of children? You know, what really is needed in terms of your particular building? If it were to need to be a shelter, you'll want to look at all of those kinds of things in order to get prepared. And again, I commend the book to you to help you do that.
Do we have time for one more question? I'll ask it, and if we're out of time, then we'll go. Okay, and there's several others that we're missing. We'll try to fill everybody in on the discussion around those questions. But here someone asks, I'm working with my congregation to help congregants learn about emergency preparedness. We discussed having congregants prepare emergency supply kits for their households. Can you suggest some incentives that I may use as part of a presentation to encourage congregants to purchase and assemble kits?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I would say maybe maybe something you could do is work with a local hardware supply store or something like that. You know, to see if they would be interested in providing discounts, or if they would be interested in partnering with you on some sort of educational opportunity. You can also host some sort of kit building party if you have a little bit of money in your congregational mission fund. You can purchase a number of the supplies, perhaps kind of approach it like an Amish barn raising or something like that. Everyone brings a little bit of something, and people put the kits together. So I think there are probably some community-based resources like that, or some just creative opportunities for relationship and community building in your own congregation to make that sort of thing happen.
Great. I think we'll stop there with the questions and have concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you, Carol.
Carol and Amy, and for our last few minutes, I turn the webinar over to our Associate Director of Domestic Response, Barry Shade. He will just give you and share with you some additional resources.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. I just want to say my Church World Service colleagues and I were more than happy to be your resource for any additional questions you have related to the long-term recovery process. Our contact info is shown here. Go to www.cwsglobal.org, and there you'll find our contact information, links to resources mentioned today, as well as a recording and PowerPoint of today's webinar. That'll happen in about 48 hours. Be sure to look at the U.S. Emergency Response Manual under CWS and partner publications. It has additional information that's useful to all faith and non-faith-based organizations and will greatly supplement the many things you've learned today. Next slide. I highly recommend you also go to the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, National VOAD as we call it. They have a host of resources on their website and will provide you access to contacting the many members of National VOAD that have recovery resources. I also highly recommend their long-term recovery guide for your preparedness toolkit as you help your church or your organization prepare. Next slide. And of course, Help and Hope, the book that we've talked about today, it is a great resource, and I thank Amy Gopp and Brandon Gilvin, the co-editors, for putting it together and making it available. Again, you can go to the Chalice Press website or to our website at CWS Global, or to find links to obtain a copy of the book. A new resource that's recently become available and is downloadable is Congregational Disaster Preparedness Guidebook, prepared and put online by the Lutheran Disaster Response, and it's available at www.elca.org. Take a look at it. Between it, the National VOAD Guide, our guide, and Hope and Help, your church or your organization can be superbly prepared if disaster should strike you. And I want to thank Amy and Brandon and all the CWS folks involved in putting the webinar together today. I think it's been insightful and will help you prepare your congregation, your church, your religious organization, or secular organization for disaster when it strikes. I do want to tell you about an upcoming webinar on October 21st. We'll present long-term recovery basics. It's a 2-hour presentation that goes into some of those different committees and organizations within the community that Brandon and Amy talked about, and gives you a little more detail on how those work and how they fit together. Again, that's October 21st. We hope that you'll join us for that. And thank you for being with us today.
this concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us and have a blessed day.